This is Global Storyline with your host Dean W. Arnold, where we examine events current and past and place them in the global storyline.
Our guest tonight is Jay Dyer. He's the creator of the website jaysanalysis.com. He's a frequent contributor to the journal souloftheeast.org, and he's also a frequent guest on some of the top alternative programs and podcasts nationally and worldwide. He's best known for his esoteric Hollywood film reviews, and also has a book coming out soon by the same name. However, his favorite material is theology and philosophy, about which he has written extensively and podcasted on extensively, and other issues that he deals with to a great deal is geopolitics, espionage, current events, and corruption theory, technology, and scientism. Couple that with a background in stand-up comedy and a willingness to do impersonations once in a while. All that makes me consider Jay to be perhaps the most interesting and comprehensive thinker out there today. So it is a privilege to interview you on Global Storyline. Hi, Jay.
Hello, Dean. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and that's really high praise. So I better be on my toes for this one.
Yeah, well, just smoke a good cigarette, drink a cup of coffee, get your whole arsenal together, and we'll ruin many of the Christian stereotypes right away with the cigarette. That'll just get rid of all the people we want to get rid of right from the get-go.
Evangelicals are already turning off their...
Yes, there they go, even as we
clicking
speak.
the X button.
Okay, lots of things to talk about. That introduction, you're so eclectic, I could have introduced you a number of ways, so I enjoyed doing that. But first thing I wanted to say is, of course, today is a big day. It's a big annual celebration, of course. And so I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that at the very beginning of the podcast, because, of course, this is the annual celebration of being right in between the Feast of the Nativity of the Theotokos and the Feast of the Elevation of the Cross. And I just wanted to get that in because that's my little bailiwick, is that I like to organize my life based on the church calendar and not on strange and weird shootings that happen or other types of tragic events.
I like that piece you did. I agree.
So let's just get that out there first. I think there's something else going on today. I can't remember what that is, but you might be able to remind me of it.
9/11?
Oh, that's what it is. Okay, yeah. 15th or something anniversary of 9/11 today. Okay. Want to encourage everybody out there who is a little bit familiar with Jay's stuff or not familiar at all. You need to go to jaysanalysis.com. You need to subscribe. $4.95 a month, is that what it is?
Or $60 a year, and there's also the Patreon option if people want to give a different amount. It is possible.
Right. So $4.95. I've been a subscriber for about a year, I think, and I love the price point. I think a lot of people the subscriptions are like $10 a month and that sort of stuff. $4.95 is like nothing. I mean, it's like perfect, and everybody ought to do that. You ought to do it just because you're going to get a ton of great information, but you also ought to do it even if you just want to just support people who are out there giving it a go to get the truth out there in the midst of a crazy world. So encourage everybody to do that. Go ahead.
Well, I heard your interview with Tim, and you guys both made that point. That was appreciated, those plugs there. And I really do, hope to give a solid education that you're not going to get, in a university setting. So, to couple that with theology and the kind of analysis that I do, I think I agree with you. It is a good deal. And, it's grown tremendously over the last year since I've been doing it full time. So 95% approval on the part of the audience, and it's really growing to be a large archive. There's a lot of different stuff there, and the next year is just going to continue to grow.
Yeah, and I think you and I might have talked about this when we were hanging out in person. But in a perfect world, probably you ought to be in academia, but academia is so disappointed us. It's been a disappointing effort, I think.
Yeah.
And I got to thinking about it the other day. I'm not a real Latin scholar or anything, so I might butcher this.
Yeah.
But doesn't university mean one truth? So, that's where the university. Of course, I guess universities came out of Middle Ages, where theology was the queen of the sciences and that sort of thing, and so
Exactly.
and so all things were sort of unified in Christ, in good theology, and we just don't have that anymore. And I can't find it really anywhere. And you're one of the few places where I see all the areas of reality kind of being dealt with the one truth being Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so you ought to be in the university, but the university is no longer a university. It's a what would you call it? A mini-versity, a confused versity, a pagan versity.
It's diversity.
A diversity, yeah. I mean, it's a lot of things.
It's all about diversity, supposedly.
I got you. Diversity, sure.
Yeah, right. And it's Cardinal Newman, wrote that famous book, around 100 years ago, that the university is supposed to represent the, as you pointed out, unification of the sciences under the queen of the sciences, theology. And that's been the tradition for both East and West, especially, in Byzantium, theology played such a central role. So that's the way it should be. Since the Enlightenment and these different movements, we've seen a radical shift in Western education. There's books that even treat that from the academic establishment. There's a famous book by Louis Dupré. I've got it over here. It's called Passage to Modernity, and he charts the history of education and the trek of ideology in the West he's a Yale scholar, Yale culture scholar, and he points out all the things that we're talking about. So it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just the way that things unfortunately happen in the West. And academia, unless you're in a certain section or if you're in private schools or something like that, is not really amenable to this kind of discourse and this kind of thinking, because as you pointed out, it was all about breaking down into disparate, unrelated fields. And so if you do biology, you're not supposed to have any connection to the arts. If you do the arts, it's your own subjective experiment or existential experience, and that's supposed to have nothing to do with philosophy. But historically, these would all be, placed under classical education, and they would be under God. So absolutely.
I got a good buddy in Roanoke, Virginia, which is 20 minutes from Blacksburg, which is where Virginia Tech is. Mm-hmm. And we were having this conversation a little bit. I was bemoaning the fact that there is no university anymore, no more one truth. There's nothing that brings everyone together philosophically at the university. And he said, I don't think you were quite familiar with the concept called college football. So I guess there is a one truth, but it's just a little bit...
If you're from Tennessee, I'm sure you're familiar with it because people worship UT.
Oh yeah, exactly. It's so it was a pretty funny joke, but it was a little bit sick joke because there's so much truth to it. Right. I was going to point out one other thing, and that I went to a pretty good Christian college, I think, and there are some good Christian colleges out there, but I really can't put them in the category of doing the one truth thing, in the sense that they sort of follow the nod of the peer pressure of academia, don't want to get too far out on the edge, with government corruption, conspiracy theory, other issues like that, for a lot of reasons. But they're the tax fundies issue that's certainly one of the issues. And I think even it wasn't for that, I think just the culture there on a campus now just doesn't seem to lend itself to taking risks like that. So there are some good Christian colleges that put Christ at the center, but I just they're not quite doing it for me in terms of bringing it all together.
Yeah, I attended a Baptist Bible college for a while, and there were aspects of it that were enjoyable, but that was at a time when I was about 20, 21, when my theological views were changing quite a bit, and I was looking into Catholic ideas, looking into ideas like infant baptism and these kinds of things, moving out of Baptist thinking. And once you have a theological shift like that, it's just not really amenable to, it doesn't work to keep attending a Baptist college, mainly because they want you to attend Southern Baptist at where I went, school, or excuse me, you're supposed to attend a Southern Baptist church. And I didn't want to, but they were, which I guess it's sensible from their perspective. If we're training you to, learn the Bible, we would like you to be a Baptist preacher, right? So, yeah, I mean, unless you choose a denominational school like that, you're not really going to get the theological education, which would have been traditionally what you'd have even in regular education, would have been part of your liberal arts. But yeah, it's just that we live in a different world, and it's more of a catacomb situation almost.
Right. I
guess you could argue.
I went to a Christian college. I went to a Christian college that I think had a little better approach than what you're talking about. It's Covenant College on top of Lookout Mountain in Chattanooga. It's the College of the Presbyterian Church of America, which is a strong conservative Bible believing denomination, and I thought they did pretty good.
PCA,
yeah, I thought they did a pretty good job of exploring theology and being open to different ideas and being intellectually honest. I just think that in those campus settings, because you got to raise so much money and you got to be beholden to major donors and that kind of thing, you're not in a place where the professors can really push the envelope and really question how corrupt things are in our society. So I want to get that out there. I'm going to move on to kind of talking about your background. You just started to nibble on it a little bit, but first I got a list of your 15 past podcasts that I'm going to read, because we are going to have some listeners who just aren't familiar with you, and here you and I are having all this general conversation about you and what you do. But let's get to it specifically. So here's your last 15 podcasts. Number 1. Hybrid Wars and Faux Revolutions, which is a geopolitics. Next one, Classical Nihilism and the World Order. That's a philosophical thing. Next one, Hollywood Voodoo, which is obviously film and esoterica and the occult. The Metaphysics of Postmodern Imperialism, some kind of philosophy. Next one, Underground Bases for the Elites. I don't know what you call that, UFO research. The next one is Genesis and Creation Mysteries. That's really a theological piece. The next one is B Movies. The next one is, Was the Hippie Movement a CIA op? I don't think so. That's not what you titled it, but I'm trying to cut to the chase. The next one is The Cult of Reason and Alchemical Scientism. So some version of science and philosophy. Next one is Examining Plato's Republic, philosophy and geopolitics. Next one is Hollywood Mind Control. Next one is Orthodox Theology, Thomism, and Gregory Palamas. Theology. 2 more. Hitchcock's Psycho-Psyche. And the last one, this is my generalization. Many interviews on possible fake shootings and other tragedies. So now you guys who are listening have an idea of what I'm talking about when I say Jay is dealing with just about everything.
One caveat I would add is that I don't do or believe in aliens, so that's not a UFO thing. But we do talk about we try to get to the bottom of the question of underground bases in that one that you mentioned.
I appreciate you clarifying that. A UFO means unidentified flying object, and that's the way I was sort of looking at it. But you're right. People might think that's aliens, and
I just don't like to give the impression that I believe it. Yeah.
You believe in aliens if they're demons.
Yeah, the principalities and powers that Paul talks about, but not the extra biological entities of ET or anything like that.
No, I get that. Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's get into the bio first, and particularly the religious bio. That's what I'm most interested in. And just as a setup, you already mentioned you're raised Baptist. I forget what you did next, but I think it was Calvinism and the Reformed thing, and then you became Catholic, and now you're Eastern Orthodox. So I want to hear about all those. I particularly want to talk Calvinism with you because that's my background, and there's probably I don't know of anybody else in all the podcasts that I've listened to who've asked you a lot of questions about that. So we'll spend a little time on that. But so start with where you were. You were Baptist, and then what happened?
Well, I was invited to a lot of Bible studies back in that time period. It was around 1819. I dove into reading the Bible pretty extensively and regularly, and in that inevitably brings up a lot of theological questions. You know, you want to try to deal with these issues of, well, the book of Acts talks about people supposedly doing miracles, and does that mean the Charismatics are right, or these more high churches with their, you know, Anglican style liturgies, is that more correct, or is it something that we should just be doing in a strip mall? Or you're inevitably confronted with these kinds of questions when you begin reading the Bible, and, you know, you've got friends that go to all these different churches, and they're inviting you to different churches. And so I kind of tested them all out, and the more that I read, that led to, you know, interest in other topics like church history. And so while on the surface, the way that you read it, it might sound like somebody listless sort of bouncing about, but I see it more as of a logical and historical progression that, you know, and a lot of other people have had the same experience where they went through either similar churches or similar periods of theological awakening, you might say, you know, stages or phases of the same sort of trail, you know, that you're going down. And I don't think that you know, it wasn't just me picking what I wanted. It was me, you know, sincerely wanting to deal with really sometimes tough questions. You know, if you're going to a Baptist Bible college and you're confronted with, you know, I read Augustine's City of God at that time. I was about 21, and I took a lot of those questions to two of my Baptist professors, and I didn't feel like they had sufficient answers to a lot of the questions and issues that Augustine raises, such as, you know, what is the nature of grace? What is the nature of church government, the episcopacy? What is the nature of all manner of things, right? Relics, all these kinds of weird Catholic-ish type issues that at that time I understood to be Catholic. And that was very difficult because I was really enmeshed in the Reformation tradition by that point, when I was after about a year of Bible college. And I'd read through Calvin's 1556 Institutes. That's his later, more fuller treatment. So I was really, really thoroughly on board with Calvinism. And I'd also been reading some of the Reconstructionists and people like Gary North and Greg Bonson and James Jordan and R.J. Rushdoony. And I felt like that was pretty solid stuff, but none of these people, and I knew a lot of the people in the, you know, the Reconstructionist circles and a lot of those Reformed Presbyterian circles, when I would reach out to different ministers or presbyters or whatever, elders, I didn't feel like I was ever getting sufficient answers to questions that were very similar to the ones that I posed to my Baptist preachers. So I saw a lot of common ground there, a lot of similarity between a lot of being unfamiliar, you know, with the first 1,500 years of the church. Now,
stop there for a second. You say a couple of common questions you had problems with the Baptists and the Presbyterians. Can you tell us what those questions were?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that you know, what I found was that if it came to you know, even Lutheran friends I had, or Calvinist minister friends that I had, and elders and buddies, anything past 1,500, you're good. You can get, you know, times and dates and seasons and every little bit of information you wanted. Right. But when it came to things prior to that, there was almost no knowledge. And I had a period where I decided to not continue Baptist Bible College. And at that time, there was such a thing as Bonson Seminary, which was Greg Bonson's kind of personal thing. Now, he had already passed away, but it still existed, and you could still do it through kind of correspondence. So I did that for a year, and they had a really intensive church history class, amazingly. I met a guy who was a pretty sharp guy named Chris Strevel. I believe he's still a Presbyterian minister somewhere. But he taught this class, and we read about 10 books on ancient and medieval church. And some of that was the church fathers. Other books were just kind of general treatments of the medieval era of the church. And that raised more questions for me. So basically what it came down to was, around that time period, around age 22 or 23, I went ahead and invested in the Church Fathers set that you see here in the background. Awesome. And I just started diving in. Now, at that time, as I said, I read Augustine's City of God when I was 21, but I'd not read any of these other Western Church Fathers. So the more that I read, and that's really where I stayed focused, was Western Fathers, I kept finding references to things like the Eucharist and the saints and the relics and confession or liturgy, or these kinds of big button issues, you know, that are supposed to be idolatrous and supposed to be heresy, supposed to be all these damnable things according to, you know, pretty hardcore puritanical Calvinism. And I was a big fan of the Westminster Confession. So I wrote a lot of these questions down, and I would kind of shop them around to different people I knew. Another big issue that came to me was the question of how the Bible, as a canon, as it's called, the canon of books that are in the Bible,
yes,
how that formation process happened. And so what I did was I didn't go to Roman Catholic apologists or Orthodox apologists. I went to a bunch of evangelical apologists. So I read F.F. Bruce. I read some other some Protestant thinkers who tried to make sense of this. Even Protestant apologists, like there's a guy Webster or somebody like that who wrote against this from the Catholic and Orthodox side. And I've just found so many references in the Protestants and the evangelicals that I couldn't make sense of how we were supposed to believe, on the one hand, of this long period of apostasy in the church, but at the same time they were the ones who made the decision that what the biblical books would be. It just ended up so many ludicrous contradictions that I didn't feel like I was getting good answers, and at that point I didn't feel any moral opprobrium for beginning to read or talk to people from Catholic or Orthodox churches. And at that time, I was in a very hardcore Presbyterian, puritanical type church. We were even more strict than the PCA that you're talking about. So
I know the type. I know the type.
The TR, truly reformed.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so I went outside of the bounds of what you're supposed to do, and I met with some Catholic priests, and I took questions to them. I didn't know anybody Orthodox at that time, although I did get a hold of a couple Orthodox books, like Timothy Ware's book. But I was still very just obsessed with Western Catholicism because that was really all I knew. I never visited an Orthodox church or anything like that. And so I continued to read, Jerome and Ambrose and Augustine even further. And when I read Augustine against the Donatists and Augustine against the Pelagians, and probably a couple thousand pages worth of his works beyond the City of God, at a certain point I was and he's a big hero, oddly enough, to the Reformed. It just made no sense. It was like this guy, he's either a hero or he's not. I mean, if everything in the
because he talked about predestination a lot.
I know, right? Yeah, but there's all these other things, right?
Oh yeah, right.
So that just eventually just fizzled out, and I think I had a period of about 8 months where I went to a PCA church because I couldn't deal with the TR, the truly reformed that I was formerly going to.
Can you tell me what part of the country you're in, or does that reveal too much?
No, I don't care. I was attending, at that time, it was a church in Jackson, Tennessee, and I don't know if he's still the minister there. This was, 12 years, 10 years ago. His name's Grover Gunn.
Memphis area, for those of you who don't know, yeah.
Yeah. And Grover was a really great guy. He had actually studied directly under Greg Bonson and knew him personally, and we had a good relationship, very friendly, but I also didn't feel, and that actually kind of made it a little bit more difficult because I felt like he was sincerely at least trying to deal with a lot of the issues and questions I was bringing. And I had a time period where I read some Anglican books and thought, well, maybe the Anglicans kind of have the middle road or whatever. But I finally just decided, no, there's just too much evidence in the West for the office of the papacy and the real presence in the Eucharist and these kinds of issues, that I set aside all the other Catholic issues that I wasn't sure about. I was already kind of wondering about the liberalism and Catholicism, but I just said, well, that'll all settle itself out because I know what the church fathers say, and I know that these are the people who decided what books were in the Bible, so they're probably right on these other things.
Right.
So I started attending a mass locally around here. I did that for a couple years, or maybe about a year, and then I decided I would, go through the catechumen classes for Roman Catholicism and join the church. Went through conditional baptism and chrismation.
Did you have any person in your Presbyterian-Reformed Calvinist circles ever sit down and talk with you or confront you or that sort of thing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, tell us about that.
Many of them.
How'd that go?
Well, the original hardcore TR church got very, very nasty and very threatening and forbade me to read any of these books. And I felt like that was a direct violation of the principles of even the Westminster Confession when it comes to, issues of conscience. So that ended up in kind of just a clean break with that group. It was two or three elders over time that I got letters from some elders. I got, even back then, I got a call for interviews, but I wasn't doing anything public. This was just kind of my private conversion. But I've been very active in helping to build that church at that time, and I brought a lot of my college friends, into this mission church, is what it started out as. And so it was kind of a big deal to a lot of people in that relatively small group, because we had been so anti-Catholic for so long that for me to have such a radical change like that, they felt was pretty devastating, I guess, to some people. And the minister himself, of course, was the most adamant in his lockdown. Like, if you do this, we will bring church government will excommunicate you, basically, the reformed version of excommunication. So I just decided to leave the church, and I said, well, I'd rather transfer to another presbytery, which is what I did. So I ended up driving for about a year to another church. So, it amounted to a series of events and a series of interactions and meetings, and then you step into a whole other world, the Roman Catholic world, which is very different from the Reformed version of things. And
let me stop you there.
Yeah.
I want to explore just a couple things. For me, the issue of sola scriptura, the issue of where the canon came from, really the issue of authority was the entire issue. Now, you also bring up things like, the real presence in the Eucharist and liturgical worship and those kind of things. I guess those were just sort of other things maybe that also brought to light the issue, but it really comes down to this authority issue, right? I mean, where Protestants and the Reformed people, they point to Scripture. It's all about sola scriptura. Everything comes from the Scripture. But if you can't come up with a good solid case as to who decides what's in Scripture and what is Scripture and which books go into it, then that whole thing kind of crumbles. So for me, that was the whole thing.
Yeah. At this stage in my life, and when it was the issue in my mind of Catholic versus Protestant, that was the issue ultimately. Yeah. Now, later down the road, it will become a more complex issue between Rome and Orthodoxy when it comes to the person of Christ and to the theology of God. That's what would be the deciding, not so much the issues of the papacy, although that might play into it with what we see at Vatican II and after Vatican II in the Roman Catholic world, which for me was a great testament to Orthodoxy. But
why don't you go move into that? Just tell us how you moved from more details from Catholicism to Orthodoxy. The person of Christ. I mean, now what does that mean?
Well, I want to add too, though, that I had about an 8 or 10 year period of Roman Catholicism, so it wasn't fly by night thing. It was something that I took very seriously. I even considered monastic life for a while. I thought about the Dominicans and so forth, and
it's not too late.
Well, not with the Dominicans.
I'm talking about being a monastic.
I know what you mean, but I think they.
I'm just giving you a hard time.
I don't. The Dominicans seem to be pretty heavy on the homosexual side in Roman Catholicism, so I was not interested in that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That experience, and I actually met with the diocesan, the guy who vets people for that, and he seemed basically gay himself, and that was a big turnoff for me. So I was like, I'm not doing that. The reason I mention all that is that there's an important phase where I got really into Catholicism, and I dove into all of the classic Catholic sources. So Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, and then the Council of Trent. Trent produced its own catechism, which was very famous and used most often for traditional Catholics before I think in the 80s, the church put out the new catechism. So prior to that, it was the Catechism of Trent, which was crucial. The Boston Catechism was another famous one, and you had a lot of papal documents that were considered normative for Western Roman Catholicism across the board until the time of Vatican II. And I dove really, really intensely into Vatican II. I read all the documents. I met with and talked to various Catholic theologians across the spectrum, because it's a very difficult issue, and it's still playing out now in the world of Roman Catholicism, because it's such a radical departure from the Tridentine Catholicism and prior to that even. So that for me was a big issue because, I went into Catholicism and into the church fathers thinking, I want that faith. I want to believe what everybody's believed in, the true faith. And then what we find in Roman Catholicism, and then it's the fruits of of Vatican II, which is all of this just really insane liberalism that at times goes beyond Anglicanism. It's staggering. There's nothing like it, and that I can ever think of in history. And it really is that bad. I saw a lot of it firsthand, and I mean, not any of the pedophilia stuff, but I did research that quite a bit, read several books on it, and I knew a lot of priests, and I knew people who had dealt with that scandal and issue in the church. Not priests that were pedophile priests, but I'm saying that dealt with the aftermath. And so I'm not just saying that the moral issues are, of course, I believe, an outworking of the theological problems, and the theological problems are manifested evidently at Vatican II. And so we have this departure from even teachings of the popes 20 or 30 years before that. I mean, you have these documents like Mortalium Animos, which is a famous papal encyclical of Pius XI, where he says that large ecumenical prayer gatherings that intend to relativize the church, he says that's apostasy. And then by the time of John the 23rd and Vatican II and Paul VI, that now becomes the Holy Spirit. So what was apostasy 30, 40 years earlier becomes the work of the Holy Spirit. And this is a big issue now in Roman Catholicism. And you have this giant group called the Society of St. Pius X and other traditional groups that represent a kind of schism of probably 1 million people within the so-called Roman Catholic Communion who basically haven't followed anything since Vatican II. And now that's different from the rest of the world that follows Benedict and Bergoglio. But those fissures, those theological divisions were a big problem for me. That I dealt with that for many years, because in Catholicism, you're not supposed to commune and go through that kind of stuff if the bishops and the theologians are outwardly preaching heresy. And canon law in the Roman Catholic Communion is called an ipso facto excommunication. So, for example, if a Catholic has an abortion, they're automatically excommunicated. But the problem is that in canon law, the same thing applies for bishops that preach heresy openly, and many of them do, and nobody does anything about it. So the question then is, well, where do you go to Mass? Well, you go to Mass where you know that it's a Latin Mass, and you know that it's going to be solid and Orthodox, and so that requires driving 2 hours and so forth. So I did that for a long time, and then finally it was just like, something's off here. Like, this is not matching up to the Church Fathers. It's not matching up to, what I thought I was getting into. And so I began to consider, well, maybe there's other options. I don't really know a lot about Orthodoxy, and this is around 2006 or 7. So I started reading the Eastern Church Fathers, and I met some Orthodox guys who were pretty solid. Still friends to this day with some of those guys. And it was just kind of opening up another world. And in the Orthodox world, and I hesitated for a long time. I was very iffy, because there was a lot about Catholicism that I appreciated and that I liked. Even back, when I was a Calvinist, there were aspects of Calvinism that I appreciated. All the emphasis on the Bible, but I felt like it just wasn't. There was something missing, and so in the same way with Catholicism, I felt like there was something missing, and I just dove into the Eastern Church Fathers, and I visited some Eastern divine liturgies, and I was just very impressed with what I felt was, I thought that 2006, 2007, much more faithful to the Church Fathers and to the biblical witness than what I experienced in the various flavors of Roman Catholicism. So the issue of the papacy is part of this matter, because the papacy is a focal point of Vatican II, because Vatican II argues for collegiality, that the Bishop of Rome should not really exercise this monarchical supreme pontifex role that he's been functioning in the last 1,000 years of Western Christianity. He needs to tone it down, basically. And that goes directly against Vatican I. So in other words, ironically, the Protestant an Anglican influence at Vatican II, argued for a more collegial view, something more Eastern. So I'm sitting here thinking, well, if I'm Roman Catholic and we're sitting here arguing for a collegial view of the bishops and the patriarchs, like how is Orthodoxy wrong anymore? So that kind of opened up the possibilities for me to look into Orthodox theology, and I did that. That was a long process as well. Not just intellectual. I mean, I obviously took it serious in the sense of beginning to get Eastern prayer books and icons and the normal modes of Orthodox worship that are very different from how you approach things in Catholicism. And so I mentioned earlier the person of Christ and the theology, and that ultimately was the clincher for me, because that's the aspect that sets Orthodox theology off most clearly from Catholicism, even though a lot of Orthodox people wouldn't necessarily say that. First off, a lot of Orthodox people might think, well, we believe in a lot of the same Trinity Jesus stuff, but it's that Pope thing. But it's not. It's the Pope or Vatican II. These are manifestations of more fundamental theological differences, even if people may not be aware of it, because when you go back and you read the Eastern Councils and the Eastern Fathers, you'll see a different theology explicated. And so that's why, I would still say that I find Orthodoxy to be way more convincing, and I've not experienced anything that would lead me to think otherwise. In other words, I don't ever see myself going back to Roman Catholicism or Protestantism.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. I got a lot of questions for you, but that was going to be one of my questions. What is it about being Orthodox now? Who's to say, well, in 3 or 4 years, Jay's going to go on his next jag?
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose for any of us, because of free will, the possibility of being in error or being convinced of something else is a potentiality for anybody. I mean, who can say where they'll be tomorrow? We don't know that, so I can't say with divine certitude, that I won't make a mistake or be convinced of something. But the reason that, as I said before, I think if you understand the theology, you see it as a progression. You see it as certain things leading to other things. And what I see with Orthodox theology, as explicated by certain Orthodox theologians and apologists, I think that you can see how, whether it's Judaism or Islam or Christianity, there's only a certain number of options that you can choose for monotheism that will take you down a certain path, right? So certain arguments is what I'm trying to say is that certain arguments can cancel out those positions and show the correct position, I would say. Now, that might be a little too complex for our talk, but so for example, the teaching on the difference between the essence and energy of God in Eastern theology, this is not in Roman Catholicism. In fact, it's not possible to have it in Roman Catholicism because of the dogmatic definitions of previous Roman Catholic councils, and particularly at Trent, that define things like created love and created justice, and the fact that all of God's attributes are strictly to be identified with his essence. That's stated numerous times in Denzinger, which is the central source of Catholic dogma officially. It's a famous book put together of all the dogmatic statements.
Yeah, I'll stop you there, because that is that we are getting into some obtuse stuff, which would be fun for a whole separate podcast. But I would add on to that, for me personally, why I have a settled sense that I'm not going to be running into another Christian expression in the next few years, is that when becoming Orthodox, you're actually joining a tradition that has pretty much been the same since the beginning.
Yeah.
And I've made jokes about my father, who was a great evangelical pastor, but he would always make fun of the people who would say we've always done it that way. And because he was progressive, he wanted to move on and that kind of thing. Well, when you become Orthodox, for the first time, people can say we've always done it this way, and they're being legitimate and authentic because they actually have always done it that way. when you were a Protestant, it was like, well, at some point you weren't doing that way because you broke off from the Catholics, that kind of stuff, So,
Right.
but this is a faith. This is a way of life. This is a following of Jesus Christ that has been done the same way since the beginning, and it's not going to change. This tradition doesn't allow you to change it. It's going to continue the same way as it always was. And until I became Orthodox, I thought the only way you could kind of get into that kind of a mojo was be Catholic. I didn't want to be Catholic, and when I found out that the Catholics actually broke away from the Mother Church, that all sort of the light kind of came on.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that for me, that's the answer to that question. I want to also mention to you, I'm sort of a parlor theologian, so don't take me too seriously. But I have to deal with my friends and do a lot of defense of orthodoxy with a lot of Protestants. And one of the things I say is that if you had to just sum up the difference between the East and the West and Western Christianity in two words, you would say that the East focuses on persons, mm-hmm. and the West focuses on propositions. So rationalism and propositional kind of truth about God is sort of where everything is obsessed on in the West, whereas in the East, it's about persons. It's about the person of Jesus Christ. It's about the Trinity. It's about having a real encounter, a real personal relationship with the triune God. And then personages are all through Eastern Christianity. There's icons, like you mentioned. There's people all over the walls. There's lots of people being prayed for in the litanies. There's angels everywhere, and angels talked about. There's the departed that get prayed for a lot and talked about a lot. Just everywhere you look, there's persons, and so that's one way that I describe it.
That is a good basic explanation, and you're right in terms of how things play out. I would add that it is also the theology of person that is distinct in Orthodoxy that makes it different from the West, be that Roman Catholicism or Protestantism. And I believe that there is an actual revealed anthropology in the New Testament, and we can look, and those Greek terms are important, the way they're used in the New Testament. I'm not going to get too deep, but so it's not just a matter of the fact that there's this more intimate relationship aspect. There is, but that more intimate relationship aspect is based on the fact that the Orthodox theology teaches a different perspective on man and man's nature and God, and God's the way God reveals himself and relates to us than the West does. And that's a different starting point. So that's what I was saying earlier about the differences between any of the same monotheistic faith, is that the starting point is different. And that then out of that flows a lot of distinctions from Judaism, Islam, or other manifestations of Christianity.
Don't you think there might be a tie-in in what we're talking about in terms of authority, that if you're a Western Christian, your authority comes from this rationalistic set of propositions, particularly Protestants.
Well,
whereas if you're Orthodox, you accept the authority of a bunch of persons who keep handing it down to you.
Yeah, the living church, right. The church is always a living icon of God and of Christ, and I'm not meaning to downplay that. I'm just saying that if I had a recent interaction with a Protestant Reformed buddy of mine, and we were talking about icons and the theology of icons, and for him it was all about, whether the commandments forbid this action. And I said, well, we can have that debate and we can talk about different issues in Scripture, and I wrote an article on that. But prior to that is the question of our differences about who God is and the theology of God. And so our practice is a reflection of the belief, and the belief, ironically, this is the key point for the Protestant, is that all of these things that we're talking about and that the church fathers hammered out of these 7 councils that deal with Jesus and his person, they're using the Greek terms that come out of the New Testament. So if you're having a problem with icon, that's in Hebrews, right? He's the icon of the Father. If you're having a problem with the question of energies of God, Paul uses that terminology in the New Testament. He talks about the operations of the Spirit, and the word he uses there is the same word that we use. If you have a problem with person versus physis, those nature, those are Greek terms, and I'm not just saying you have to know Greek. I'm saying that the irony is that for Protestants and guys that would go to Bible college and learn Greek, these are all the Greek terms in the New Testament that are used by the church fathers when they say what the revelation of Christ's person is, and that provides our anthropology, which is a revealed anthropology about the healing of man.
One last question, and then we'll move on to the next section of the interview. For the Protestants and the evangelicals who are listening to us talk, and they can't quite get past the whole concept of hanging out in church and doing whatever the Spirit leads you to do, and all of a sudden we've gone into liturgy and incense and cathedrals and robes and cassocks and all that kind of stuff. And I'd like to explore this a little bit more in articles and podcasts, and I'm not sure exactly where to turn, but so what do you say to your friends who can't get past the whole concept of somehow extemporaneous, from the hip sort of expressions and all sorts of stuff has sort of become in our culture, I don't know, somehow equivalent to divine encounter. How do you deal with that? What kind of things do you say? It's kind of like,
You mean
like jazz music compared to classical. It's like, to be really modern and really following God and the Holy Spirit, it has to be something that's sort of extemporaneous and not something that's scripted out.
Well, I would say that throughout the Bible, the majority of the time that we see the prophets or the schools of prophets or anything to do with the worship of God is always structured liturgy. Even Abraham had a structured liturgy that he participated in with Melchizedek in Genesis. So from the beginning of time, God's worship has not been disordered. And when you see the liturgy being laid out for the construction of the tabernacle and the temple, it's ordered. Jesus attended synagogue worship that was ordered. It was not happenstance or chaotic or what people think is charismatic. It's always been that way. And the earliest church functioned that way. The church in Acts, they had lights in the windows. In other words, they had liturgy. So they had an altar, according to Hebrews. So that is really, I think, just a cultural assumption based on probably the practice of people who have just gone to different non-denominational Protestant churches or evangelical churches where they've not thought about that aspect of we believe and we practice things that we see as having a lot of continuity with the Old Testament. And unfortunately, at times, you get even in Orthodoxy the idea that the Old Testament's this evil, mean God, and now we're the nice, loving Jesus God, or so it's some sort of antinomian or Gnostic thing. That's not true. Most of the arguments of the Church Fathers and even into the middle patristic and medieval era, they will argue that there's much more continuity between that period and our period. And so the worship doesn't, it alters in the sense that the church is now, the covenant is now made open to the Gentiles. But the form of that worship is laid out in things like the Apocalypse, where John sees windows of visions into heaven, and he sees all this imagery, and he sees, incense, and he sees prayers, and he sees patterns of worship that are structured. And that's when we believe that when the apostles went out and they established the different bishoprics and sees of the ancient church, that they established liturgies, basic patterns of worship. And that is part of the apostolic tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good answer. I repurchased Frankie Schaeffer's Dancing Alone because he's got 3 or 4 pages where he addresses this a little bit, not in enough detail as I'd like, but he talks about America having sort of the transcendental movement and then some of the revivals, and that this concept that we're talking about is not so much a Christian evangelical bent as it is an American bent, because the same thing happens with losing weight or becoming licking your alcohol addiction or kind of stuff. There's this abracadabra magic moment sort of where everything changes. that has become a big
Right.
part of the American psyche, and so Christianity has gotten shoehorned into that whole mentality.
Yes, this comes out of the New Light Presbyterian movement, which gave birth to a lot of revivalism, and then that kind of gave birth to the Azusa Street revival and charismaticism in American Christianity. And all those movements, instead of being focused on the noetic worship of God, shifted things to the bodily worship. Is that rationalistic Calvinism was lacking the place of the body, and so what they did was they inverted things and they turned it into it being all about the body. And I would say that Orthodoxy is a phenomenal combination of the mind, the body, and the spirit or the nous.
All right, moving on to our next little section here, and this is just, we won't spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to kind of kick some tires with you. I've got this new podcast that I've started. It's called globalstoryline.com. And so I kind of bought a cool domain name that I really like, but I also want to sort of begin to flesh out some of the concepts that I'm trying to do here. I have a sense that when people stumble upon alternative media and they hear people, like yourself, like the interviews Tim Kelly does, that kind of thing, they hear you're talking about a certain current event. But there's layers and layers of things that have been going on in history that a person, if they just stumble across it, they sort of have to have other articles and other bits of information they're funneled to begin to get an understanding of it. So, for example, here's a micro incident to a kind of a macro view of things, and I hear you talk about this kind of stuff. Here's 5 levels that I came up with earlier today to kind of get us into this conversation. But suppose that a current event comes up where there's like a satanic killing, and the authorities seem to be covering it up, and so that so you got the alternative media, whoever's kind of dealing with it. Well, a storyline that's kind of behind that you kind of need to know in order to be able to grasp this kind of stuff is that law enforcement has been involved with secret societies and a lot of sort of semi-satanic stuff for a long time. In fact, the Jack the Ripper problem in London in the late 1800s is likely, associated with a lot of the similar kind of Masonic cover-up. And in order to grasp something like that, which is a pretty tough thing to chew, is that law enforcement for a century has been tied in with satanic and secret society kind of crap. That this has been actually going on since the Enlightenment. I've heard you talk about Elizabeth having direct ties with John Dee, who was an occultic who was summoning spirits, and so this is actually kind of a 500-year-long thing in Western culture. But if that freaks you out, you need to know that the longer story is that really throughout human history, kings have been involved in the occult, probably more of the rule than the exception, and that things like the power of human sacrifice and how that can really empower you in your rule has always been a temptation and often practiced in monarchies and governments that aren't following God. Of course, we see that in Israel in the Old Testament. And then one more layer to peel back. And I've heard you talk about this too. But to really get a sense of that, you got the Book of Enoch, and you've got Enoch sharing with us that really what happened right around the fall is that these watcher angels, these evil angels, actually came to mankind and gave them all these secrets and all this stuff having to do with the occult and astrology and even things like the power of human sacrifice and all those kind of things that allow you to have the secrets to run the world. So I need to write 5 really good articles and do 5 really good podcasts and then point people to all the kind of work that you've done on these kind of things to sort of give people a sense of the many layers that may be behind a one current event that we're dealing with today that's kind of weird. Now, I don't know if that's a question or not. That is so I'm I'm going to back that up in the form of a question and ask you to see if you can put those 5 different storylines or 5 different layers I just laid out there into like a better headline. How would you describe? And I've heard you say one time that you felt like this was actually the story, the ultimate storyline of what's happened in humanity, at least with the bad guys. Describe to us what happened with Enoch, what he did with humanity, or I mean, what the Watcher Angels did with humanity, and how today the elites are trying to do the same thing.
Well, let me say first that you're right about the dangerous, or the folly, I guess, the folly of the idea of mass information and journalism. That's not to say that there's no such thing as a journalist, but that the idea of a journalist and mass news, this is all it all emerges from the post-Enlightenment period as well, and because we get out of that the idea of the informed citizen, that every citizen is going to be this educated Thomas Jefferson founding father type guy who's going to seriously engage the issues and go down to his town hall and whatever, and that requires then keeping up abreast of the papers and what they all say, and that kind of that doesn't exist. That is an Enlightenment fiction and idealization of how the citizenry would operate. And that's not how humans operate. That's a universalized assumption that the Enlightenment thinkers had. So the very idea of having a mass information outlet that can cover all the bases isn't really feasible, but I do think that it's possible to be myself and cover the issues. You mentioned personalism earlier. Cover the issues as the person that I am, and from what I know and from what I've experienced, and try to tie things together, because we live in this period when we're under the illusion that all these things are not connected, be it different fields of biology and philosophy, or be it things like events, current events, geopolitical events, or history, or so forth. So I don't worry too much about, how come your website doesn't have a start here page, like you got to take step one, because it's not my job to explain everything to every single person. I'm writing for an audience that's already going to be interested in what I do, and if people like it, they like it. If they don't, they don't. So to answer the rest of the question, the Book of Enoch is kind of in a quasi-canonical status for the East. It occupies a place of some degree of importance due to the fact that it was cited by Jude a couple times. And now we have the issue of the Watchers. These fallen angels are also mentioned in the Book of Daniel. So there's nothing abiblical, anti-biblical about this idea. It's hinted at in Genesis 6, I would say, pretty clearly. Although some would debate what the words mean there, but I think it's pretty clearly angels. Anyway, in Orthodoxy, there's a little bit of a different idea of what constitutes Scripture. You don't have the all or nothing idea of the Protestants who believe in sola scriptura, because, for example, sometimes you have Paul saying, "I give this not as speaking by the Spirit, but as my own opinion." Well, if you're a Protestant and you believe that everything's inspired, then you have to say that Paul is inspired by the Spirit to say he wasn't inspired when he said it was his opinion. That's pretty stupid. And so that's an indicator that even within Scripture we can have. It's not so much that the texts that have a lower status, like the Deuterocanon or Second Esdras or ecclesiastical writings, that they're not true. It's that they're not given the same reverence and preeminence as we do with the Gospels and the liturgy. So in the liturgy, for example, you'll see the Gospels kind of paraded around in the procession, having a special place that even Paul's epistles don't have. You're going to have readings from the Bible and the liturgy, throughout liturgical seasons. You'll go through the Bible into entirety, and it'll refer to all sorts of things. But there's still we can have it's not an all or nothing. We can have a precedence for certain things, the same way that we view the writings of the church fathers. We can say they are in a sense inspired by God because they participate in the spirit that Jesus breathed upon the church, without saying that they have the same level or degree of inspiration or reverence as the Gospels do. And so that's an idea of inspiration and authority for the text that's a little bit different in Orthodoxy in comparison to evangelicalism or Protestantism. So that also should be kept in mind. So it's not that we're going to cite the book of Jude and say that we know for certain that every single detail of how in the latter aspects of Jude, we're just getting these pretty wild descriptions. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying that, it's kind of like the book of the Apocalypse. The Orthodoxy doesn't have this grandiose, definitive view of what's supposed to happen, like evangelicals, like Tim LaHaye and different characters like that try to do with the Apocalypse. Now, because they're very difficult and they're not considered the most important thing for the life of the believer, like the Gospels should be. So when it comes to these fallen angels, this is a little bit deeper, difficult doctrine, and I believe that the New Testament refers to this when it talks about the powers and principalities, and Jesus talks about Satan falling from heaven like lightning, and there's plenty of Eastern theologians who've written on this topic, and even the liturgy, we read about the dominions and the powers, and this is talking about these angelic princes. So in the book of Daniel, for example, Daniel interacts with Gabriel, who comes to him and says that he could not arrive on time because he was delayed by the prince of Persia. And the prince of Persia that he's talking about the Watchers. This is mentioned again in the book of Daniel explicitly. And the book of Daniel is phenomenal. It's one of the most amazing prophecies of the coming of the Messiah and the church. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9. These are all really, really explicit statements about what the kingdom of Christ will be, how it will come in the reign of the Romans. It will smash the previous empires and will grow into a tree and envelop the entire earth, which is what we've seen in the last 2,000 years, the times of the Gentiles that Jesus refers to in the Olivet Discourse. So I would say that this idea of the Watchers is pretty evident in aspects of the Old Testament, as we mentioned earlier, Genesis, where we have this notion of large giants or Rephaim or Anakim. These are biblical terms and ideas for peoples. For example, in Genesis, I believe it's 15, when Abraham goes to war with the kings, they fight the Rephaim, and the Rephaim are these giants that are mentioned in Genesis 6. We also have a statement in relationship to the to Goliath. Goliath was so large because he descended from these people.
Well, let me stop you for a second. I like where you're going, and I don't want to divert you from it.
I know there's
but there's a question. Yeah, exactly. How does that DNA get to the other side of the flood? Any question? Any answer there? The giants are roaming around before the flood. The flood destroys everybody except Noah and his family. So I'm not sure how.
Here's the thing, right? But so when Noah and his family enter the ark and then come out, and we're told that this was the worldwide flood, what happens is they repopulate the earth, as we read in the Genesis account, and they build, of course, the Tower of Babel, and we read about God confusing the nation because of them building the tower to heaven and seeking a name for themselves and so forth. Now, what that means is that the aberrations that could have occurred with the angelic entities of the Watchers in Genesis 6 wiped out the living creatures as God's reasoning for the flood. That doesn't mean that the nations do not fall back into the contamination and worship of demons. And this, I believe, could be, and I've seen some theologians argue this possibility, this could also be for the reason for God demanding the wiping out of the Canaanites. So we're told in Leviticus that this group of people had so contaminated themselves that they deserve to be wiped out.
Very good, very good answer. I hadn't. Can you hear me? Very good answer. I just took out my headset because it was acting weird. That's a very good answer. I should have been smart enough to figure that out, but that makes sense. So that they kept doing the sex with demons thing after the flood, and that actually, if I can, you've probably already made this association too, but people have a hard time with the Old Testament God who destroys whole nations and that sort of thing. But basically the couple three places where that happens in the Old Testament, all three accounts. One is the Canaanites. You already mentioned how the Canaanites had these types of giants and that sort of thing, based on that kind of hideous occult activity. The other place we hear it about is Sodom and Gomorrah, because the Sodomites wanted to have sex with the angels there when they came to visit Lot. And of course, the other place is right before the flood. So you could make an argument that the only time God goes so far as to destroy, certain groups or populations of humanity is because in His mercy, it's the only way He can keep them from being completely defiled and and polluted by this demonic occult interbreeding.
Yeah, and when in Leviticus, I believe it's 17 or 18, when God gives the reasoning and explanation for the eradication, and I believe the term was horma in the Hebrew, where you were supposed to burn the entire place, even after you had rid the place of its inhabitants. You're supposed to burn it because the practices of these people was child sacrifice, human sacrifice, and possibly even worse, what you mentioned before with the blending of angel and human. Now that, again, I know that may sound far-fetched. By the way, I'm not advocating what many of these goofballs and alternative media do when they talk about Anakim and all this. A lot of these people are con men and shysters that are out there talking about this. I'm just looking at what the texts themselves in the Old Testament say, and many of the church fathers back this view up too. So,
well, and let me move you forward to modern day history, because I've heard you say that you believe that many of the elites today who are very heavily into the occult are trying to reproduce this same kind of, I don't know if the words reproduce or continue on.
Yes. Now, many examples of kings being, as you mentioned, involved in occult practices. This has existed from time immemorial, and I can't say for certain that I know in any instance when they did the ritual that worked and it really brought XYZ power down, or what. I can't say that, but what I am saying is that nobody can deny that human sacrifice is. Even mainline scholars will say that aside from Israelites in the Israelite practice, ancient Egyptians, ancient Hindus, all of these ancient Druids, that was the normative practice amongst the nations. And that makes sense because it jives exactly with what Enoch says, that the Watchers demanded human sacrifices. It jives with the rest of the Old Testament, and it even jives with the times that Israel fell into these practices, which God condemns numerous times in the Old Testament. So there's no reason to believe that humans are operating any different today when it comes to elite power circles, because it represents kind of the apex of the effacing of God in these actions, in the blending of species, be it bestiality, be it cannibalism, or sacrificial murder. I mean, these are believed to, and it doesn't even matter whether, even if you don't think these things are true, if a person believes that these things are efficacious and they act on them, then it's still happening.
Well, what gives you the sense of believing that this kind of thing may happen at the highest levels of the elites and not just something that happens in trailer trash, lowest parts of humanity?
Because so many accounts of it, because it's been practiced in so many societies for so many millennia, and we have, I think the weight of evidence would be on the person who just denying it to say that it never happened. I mean, it's, for example, a lot of ancient societies would sacrifice a human at the cornerstone of a new building. they were going to build a giant building. I believe even the Egyptians at times engaged.
I'm just trying to help the listener here. Just name a story or two, or a incident or two of modern day elites being involved in some of this kind of activity.
Well, William Kennedy has a book called Lucifer's Lodge, where he details a lot of practices of the infiltration of Satanism into the Catholic Church, and he's not an anti-Catholic. He's probably more of a traditional Catholic, as far as I could tell. And that book takes a lot of the cases of pedophilia in the recent decades of the Roman Catholic Church, and it puts them in context of what I'm talking about, and it deals with instances where there actually were, satanic rituals and so forth. And Malachi Martin has a book on this. You'll find exorcists that have books on this in Eastern and Western traditions. So there's no shortage of stories you can find these stories. They might be sort of suppressed in the news at times. Dave McGowan's book, Program to Kill, deals with a lot of occult and ritual murders in elite circles. We have the Dutroux affair in Belgium, which involved a lot of the Belgian elite in these kinds of practices. So it does happen. It's not always reported. We think of Savile in the UK and his interest in the occult and necrophilia and possibly other worse things as well. So,
no, that was good. No, those are some good anecdotes. Now, isn't there a kind of a well-known thinker, French, like died in 1950 or 60, Rene somebody, who kind of talks about this at a more philosophical level?
Rene Guénon?
Yes. And then I guess he had some sort of apologist or follower who wrote about him a lot, who just died maybe a year and a half ago. So I forget his name, but Guénon
talks about the occult practices of the elite, and he saw it as he was kind of one of these esotericists who ended up as a Sufi, and he saw our era as the Kali Yuga, or the long period of dark times when everything would be inverted, and that you would have these practices kind of done openly. And it's not too far afield from the declarations of the Luciferians at the Lucis Trust, supported by the UN, like Alice Bailey and Madame Blavatsky, who said that we would be entering in this age the externalization of the hierarchy, when the practices of the elite would be made and known publicly. So that seems to me to be the case. This, as so many of these stories keep coming out, and I'm sure that many, many more stories will come out. In fact, in the case of Savile and the UK stuff, there were quite a few journalists, even in the mainstream, reporting on it, saying this is just the tip of the iceberg. So, we've heard stories of cannibalism amongst royals and elites for a long time, and I think that they're probably true.
Interesting. Well, we've kind of poked around on that a little bit, and I think I'm going to kind of let that just we'll stop there on that line of questioning. We spent a lot of time on your bio. There'll be other times we can hit a lot of other projects. We've had a good little session here. I'm just going to ask you a couple little quick questions for fun. Is all your stuff backed up in case something happens to you? I mean, what happens if tomorrow Jay's website's down and we can't access your 1,000 articles and 500 podcasts? I just want to make sure that you've put it on a hard drive and sent it to your crazy uncle or something.
A lot of things are backed up. Not every single thing, but many of the articles are also mirrored on other sites. Quite a few, actually. And I don't mind people doing that when they mirror things. A lot of stuff's on 21st Century Wire. A lot of stuff's on Sold to East. Certainly not everything, but yeah, I've been planning on starting backup channels and using Vimeo and other outlets and so forth to not lose this body of work.
Yeah, do your best on that, because it'd be a shame to see that go away.
Well, and of course, a lot of these articles are stashed as well, and on my on other computers, other devices, and I'm not going to stop writing books anytime soon. So once this book's out, I'm going to write my next book, which I'd like to do something on philosophy and theology if I can find a publisher. And that will include, a lot of the stuff that I've done and kind of reformatting it and rewriting it.
Yeah, that sounds cool. So let's just mention again that you have a book coming out soon called Esoteric Hollywood. I've already pre-purchased my copy. And what's your date now? They say
it's going to be a month or two because I'm just now finishing the last bit of what are called sidebars, which is just these little inserts that kind of give a description of stuff that I'm talking about. So I've added. It took me a while. I had to do about 50 or 60 of those, and so that's another. You're getting another probably 30 or 40 pages worth of stuff with that. So the book's already kind of grown to 400 pages and 400 plus footnotes. So
cool.
So yeah, I've got just a couple more sidebars to do.
Yeah, so go ahead and order that. Where do you go? To Amazon to get that, or to your website, or where's
Amazon or tryingday.com.
Okay, gotcha. One more question. So we had an event here in Chattanooga about 6 months ago that Jay spoke at. About 25 of the top filmmakers in Chattanooga, really sharp crowd. And so I was talking to one of the guys who's just a really sharp guy. He makes a whole lot of money, and he's a brilliant wordsmith, and he's kind of a nut, kind of a playboy. But he was really into it. He's like, man, it was fantastic. But his question was, I was like, what was I supposed to do? Was I supposed to walk the aisle and, sign up for something or something like that? And so, my question to you, and I'm sure it's a question you get a lot. It's a question I like to ask a lot. But what is the call and response for being in this world that we live in and trying to expose some of the lies and get out there and fight the good fight and talk about some of the things we're talking about tonight, things that you do? What's the call to action?
Making mammon.
Making money?
I'm joking.
Okay.
Eating humans. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if you don't listen to this the right way, it could get a little weird.
What is the call to action? Well, I guess that's different for different stations of life. I quit academia to experiment with this. So this is me experimenting on trying to see, what happens if I try to teach on my own. And it looks to be going pretty well so far. So, it really just depends on what a spiritual advisor would say to a person in their various stations in life, because it's going to be different for each person. But, or did you mean what's my motivation? Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm sort of asking what is the, for the broader movement? Is it enlightenment? Is it to cause people to finally conclude that the government is corrupt and evil, and that you have to put your hope in God and not in princes and sons of men? Is it to pick up your gun and go start a revolution? I'm sure it's not that, but I mean those are the options that are out there in terms of how do you fight, this thing out there that's
right. I see what you're saying. Well, the evil that exists out there is spiritual in nature. Ultimately, it's not the forces of government. It's not ultimately just some sort of collectivism or tyranny by corporations or any of the normal slogans that might be bantered about independent media. It's ultimately, I would say, theological, and understanding what's true is directly related to the person of the Logos. The Logos is truth. It is true rationality and reason, and it's a divine person. And so any movement towards truth is, in some small way at least, movement towards the Logos, because he is truth himself. So I see, speaking to people what's true as that kind of, I guess you could say, my ministry, so to speak, although I wouldn't call myself a minister. I would just say that's what my talents or gifts would be, is in this arena. So that's the goal here, is that we got to have a right view of God, form our worldview appropriately before we can really tackle these things. And so what my site does is that it takes these hot button topics and issues and pop culture things and things that everybody's into, and it says, all right, let's look at this, let's think about it, and what aspects of it are true, what aspects of it are false, what things are pointing us to evil, what things are pointing us to God in this.
So basically, you're basically just taking a very broad view that when you move people towards the truth and we move ourselves towards the truth, we're moving ourselves towards the Logos, which is Christ. We're moving ourselves closer to God. It's a spiritual battle. That's the most important part, if not, is a key part, if not the most important part of that whole battle, is knowing God and getting closer to Christ. So kind of a general, very, very large general kind of call to action.
Well, but I mean, again, it really depends on what your talents and gifts are. If you're talking about individual action, there's no point in you can't fight DARPA. They've got drones, and they'll they can send a missile down your chimney. So that would be utterly ludicrous. Any kind of militia groups or any of those goofy groups. It's really about altering people's minds and hearts. That's the main thing. And you can't. One of the problems of independent alternative media is the idea that you can just put out information out there as if that's enough. That's not enough. It takes divine enlightenment, I would say, that God has to enlighten people to spiritual truths, and that comes through, being open and you conveying that message, hopefully, in a sufficient way.
So you're saying that moving people towards prayer in the church is very important and actually key, because just information isn't going to do it.
I think so. I don't have any delusions of being able to convince everybody of that. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But if people see the work that I do and they find it interesting, hopefully the argumentation is sound enough to lead people in that direction. So.
No, those are all good answers, and that's a question that I like to ask a lot. You talk about gifts and calling. That's probably something that's involved with me in terms of a passion. But different people are going to respond differently and have a different way and reaction on what to do. Go ahead.
I was going to say there's not much out there that deals with all these topics and tries to make sense of them. And I think that theology does make sense of a lot of this at the highest level. You were talking earlier about different levels of these things. And I would say, there's certain books that are great starting points. There's a really, really good book that affected me that I would recommend that ties in everything that we've talked about. Maybe not so much a lot of the geopolitics stuff, but the bigger picture would be a book, The Cosmic Liturgy, and this is St. Maximus the Confessor. It's a small book. It can be read, in an afternoon. I think it's 120 pages, but that Cosmic Liturgy book affected me. I read it about 10 years ago, and I think that's always stuck with me as a really profound alteration of my view of not just here and the now or good, bad, conspiracy, but rather the whole meaning of man and the cosmos is what's so profound about that book. And it's not inaccessible. It's very accessible. I think it's a St. Vladimir Seminary Press book.
Well, I look forward to getting that. And sometimes you could step back and say, "Gosh, you guys get so out there in the hooty-tooty universe that it's just kind of silly." But we actually live in a world where nobody knows what's up or down or sideways or forward. They don't know if there is a God, there isn't a God, if there is a world, if there is a mind or not, who's a male, who's a female. I mean, it's a messed up world right now. So, to back up and ask some really basic questions like, what are we doing here and why are we here and what's happening is pretty important. And once again, academia has let us down in terms of helping us shape us in terms of basic reality.
Yes. Yeah, Cosmic Liturgy, the Universe According to Maximus the Confessor.
Yeah, I'm going to read that. Let me make one last comment, and I'll let you go.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I want to correction. There's two different books. The Cosmic Liturgy one is good. The one I was thinking of is actually better. The one from St. Vlad's. It's called On the Cosmic Mystery of Jesus by St. Maximus. So I just wanted to be clear there.
On the Cosmic Mystery of Jesus.
Yeah, I'll put you the link here in the chat.
Okay. You put it in the link in the chat. What are you talking about?
Skype has a chat feature right here.
Oh, okay.
You see it?
I don't see it yet, but I'm sure.
There's a little bubble at the top that should be yellow, and then if you click on that,
I see it. It's below, but got it. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah, and speaking of, you're sort of you said you have an experiment of sort of doing academia on your own. Those of you who don't know, Jay has he's gone through, I think, 10 sessions or something, several sessions on Plato's Republic, and he's going to do more on Plato in the future and on Aristotle.
Uh-huh.
He's also done several sessions, about to finish up a long series going through Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley,
right.
Which is basically an overview of the last 120 years of Atlanticist takeover of the world. But I bought Tragedy and Hope, and for me, the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. I've read about 50 to 100 pages of Quigley, and I fell over and couldn't make it. I've read about 3 or 4 parts of 3 or 4 books of the Republic, so I'm able to listen to all your stuff and learn a lot. But I wish I was, and maybe I'll build my muscles eventually. I'll be able to actually read the texts themselves.
I completely understand. It's a laborious procedure, and I think St. Basil said that one time, that reading is like one of the most laborious procedures. So yeah, I understand.
Yeah, but I'm working on it. Well, listen, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Is there anything else you want to share before we move on this time and call it a night?
Yeah, just that if you like what you hear and you want to get deeper into any of these topics, you can subscribe to Jay's Analysis and check out my book and make use of the archives. There's hundreds of articles there on various subjects, not just movie reviews. Movie reviews are only like 1/9 or 1/10 of the total subject matter there. But yeah, so that's it. That's all I can think of.
Well, that's perfect. The search engine is kind of hard to find. You have to scroll down a long way till you get to it. But that's a pretty important feature for you, because you got zillions of things on every subject imaginable.
There's also topics, like you can do the categories of geopolitics, or
right.
And at the top, there's topic bars as well.
Yeah. Done that many times. All right, awesome stuff. Have a great night. Look forward to talking to you again. And over and out.
All right, thanks, Dean. You have a good night too.
You too.